This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, let's get started. Okay, let's get started. Today, I did say that we were going to continue the conversation on tectonics and continue where we left off last Wednesday. We're talking about Auguste Perret, and then talk about Frampton and his argument on tectonics. But I think it might be better to pick that up next week. As you kind of have noticed, we do touch on some contemporary 21st century case studies, but we have been looking at a lot of historical concepts in architecture in this first couple weeks. And that's been necessary to kind of establish a lot of background to the concepts we're going to be talking about and give some like insight into the contemporary 21st century case studies that we're going to look for the next 8 weeks. But even before I start getting into this, talking about detail, just a bit of a note on your quiz today. This is your first quiz out of 3 for the semester. And I just want to say, do not get too anxious about it. You know, if you're paying attention, you guys are showing up, especially you here, and if you just looked over your notes, you probably will do fine. And the way this class is structured, even if you have a bad week and you do horrible on the quiz or you fail, do not despair. Actually, do not despair over anything in this class. The way it is structured, there's a lot of different small assignments, so it's easy to recover. Even if you fail a quiz, or even if you fail 2 quizzes, you know, I'm not even sure, maybe 3, you can still pass the subject. I mean, like, yeah, and I mean, but you would have to do well in everything else. But if you're, what I'm trying to say is if you are trying and you're making an effort, it's actually very difficult to fail this course. Now, that being said, I think it's also very difficult to do very well. You really have to make a concerted effort to kind of, you know, get into that H1 status. But since it is a core course, and I don't know, it's not a studio subject, which I know when I was an architecture student, that was front and foremost in my thoughts. And in my time management. So, just sometimes as students, we're our own worst enemy, and there's more anxiety that's not necessary. It's just wasted energy. And if you do poorly, you know what? You'll know what to do next time. So I'm just putting that out there. So detail. Let's look at, this has been a subject of a bit of discourse, but you would think the importance of detail in architecture, there would be a little bit more said amongst architects. I mean, when we even have architects coming here and talking about their work, very, very rarely do they get and talk about their work at the level of detail. It almost seems like it's, an old-fashioned idea. But what I want to do today is look at where the idea of detail sits within the larger heading of tectonics, historically. Let's look at some authors and architects and scholars who have written about detail in architecture. And then I want to get into some historic and then some contemporary case studies that I'm really excited about, actually. And so here are three noted scholars that have written on detail. Edward Ford is perhaps front and foremost known because he wrote these two books on the details of modern architecture. And so where there's a lot of history books looking at modern architecture, he looks at these canonical case studies, including Mies and Korb and Frank Lloyd Wright, and just looks at these, very significant buildings and just analyzing the detail. And actually, if you are kind of in your mind or collecting books, that you want to ask for Christmas or eventually purchase for your own architecture library that you should be hopefully gathering for yourself. This is one that I would definitely buy. I have both of these. And there's a volume 1 and a volume 2, but it's called like the Details of Modern Architecture. And actually Peggy Deemer, in the reading, I've listed her here because I think she's the most up-to-date, more contemporary scholar that's written about detail and its impacts also on labor. And she mentions, quite often, refers to Edward Ford's text. But even before these two other scholars, there was this one Italian American who was from Italy, but then he relocated to the U.S. at the University of Penn, Marco Frescari. And he wrote this well-known essay in a little-known student journal called Via. It was the student journal at the University of Penn, architecture school. I think it had 2 volumes. But the most significant thing that came out of these 2 volumes of the student journal was this essay by Frescari called The Telltale Detail. And in this text, he cites the joint as the original detail, and it is the generator of construction. And therefore, it also is the generator of meaning in architecture. And a lot of architects and scholars feel that way, that really the essence of what it means to be an architect is a kind of combining and assembling of materials. And so, if that's artfully assembling these materials, then it's quite reasonable to suggest the joint where these materials come together is really where the architect does their work. And not only aesthetically, but also in giving meaning. It's the location of invention and innovation, and that the joint can have a sort of mimetic effect by imposing an order that reverberates throughout the rest of the design. Usually we kind of start at a large scale and then work our way in, to smaller and smaller scales, but he's kind of saying, no, actually it can work the other way if you start with the detail, and that can impose an order on the larger architecture. He also states that detail is the minimal unit in the process of signification. This is because of the understanding generated by the detail as joint. architecture and art because it is interested not only in the original need of shelter, but also putting together spaces and materials in a meaningful manner. This occurs through formal and actual joints, and the joint, that is the fertile detail, is the place where both construction and the construing of architecture take place. And so Foscari, I guess you could also associate him with Kenneth Frampton. These were texts that were written in the 80s, kind of at the waning of postmodern architecture. And this emphasis on tectonics was seen as this rear guard means of countering kind of the hegemony of postmodernism. You know, the architecture of Robert Stern and Charles Moore and Michael Graves, which was seen as a type of commercialization of architecture, and it was just seen to be a type of representative of, you know, other things other than architecture of itself. And it was seen as also kind of, I guess you could say, just a mask in front of, you know, some kind of, a kind of commercialized mask in front of a building. And it was communicating untruth about what a constructed building can be. And so you have Foscari and Vittorio Gregotti, the Italian architect, and here Foscari saying, no, let's step back. Let's go back and see what actually is it about what we do that really is expressive. And again, it's like, and in this essay, Foscari actually kind of, like Frampton, begins to show this kind of dichotomy between, you know, postmodern architects on the one side, and then this kind of growing, you know, kind of real architects that are not swayed by stylistic trends, but are really thinking about the way tectonic expression and the way materials are put together in their work. I mean, and a lot of people feel this way today, that postmodernism, it was a huge distraction from what the discipline does. And it really kind of took away our usefulness. I mean, you can even say during week one, you know, our agency in architecture is then a reclaiming of that, you know, from that moment. For Ford, Edward Ford, detailing is an act that requires the selective presentation of information. What do you show? What do you not show? What do you hide? And I'm going to talk more about this when we look at the case studies. Any of you, even if you're not working in a firm, will know not everything can be meticulously detailed. You have to decide in a very judicious manner what gets detailed, what do you show and what do you not show. When do you kind of shine this kind of, you know, coming together of materials, and when does it kind of take the backstage and you let the function or other purposes of that building be in the foreground. And finally, for Diemer, who feels that today the consistency of surface described and allowed by plyometric design is the same, if more extreme version of cladding, right? That's one of, and here she's referring to, you know, one of four of Semper's elements of architecture. And so she has this updated view of the smoothness, what is the detail in this age of smooth, curvilinear architecture. And where I was talking about surface, but she's saying this kind of parametric design is really the stressing of the cladding of those four elements. She also states that the interesting thing about the new parametric detail is that the contemporary aesthetic called célèbre, they support and mirror so closely those of the 19th century architectural theorists who struggled so hard to fight the role of detail. And she talked about this in the detailed deliberations reading that you had this week. And she's talking about Ruskin, Semper, Wagner, and Lohse recognized at the turn of the century that architecture is intrinsically found where structure is covered up, and that cladding is the essential modern tectonic modus operandi. And so modernism, even though that kind of counters a bit what, well, actually it doesn't. Edward Ford kind of also unveils a lot of this, that a lot of things that look like connections and joints in the work of, say, for example, Mies. What is supposed to look like a column is actually not a column, but decoration, and that the actual column or corner detail is just kind of embedded behind and it's unseen, to kind of have this slim minimalist. And so she's saying that, if anything, the parametric design in itself is somewhat rearguard, like represented or has similarities of the past, of the beginning of the modern movement, where it was this kind of covering up of detail that was looked at to define what modern architecture was. So, and just to go over Semper's 4 elements of the first domestic house or his Caribbean hut: the hearth, earthwork, framework, and cladding. And so what we're going to look at today deals with some of these issues, especially earthwork, framework, and cladding. For Semper, he emphasized, for him also, meaning in architecture was articulated through the architectural joint, and that the knot was the first architectural joint, and that what he was seeing at the early stages, I guess you could say, of modernism, as we saw last week, that there's a transition from a stereotomic-based architecture to one based on a series of joints. Is that what began to constitute what is architecture, this kind of architecture of assembled parts. And so he makes these two divisions within construction: the tectonic, this kind of study of lightweight assembled components of architecture, and what enters my mind, because it's also contemporaneous with the same time that he's writing this, is Paxton's Crystal Palace. But you could say that's the kind of model of what would even become of, steel post-lintel construction, versus the stereotomic, which is the heavy mass components. I mean, there would still be stereotomic architecture in the modern movement. I mean, even think we were talking about, Le Corbusier and La Habitation. However, this would be more in terms of reinforced concrete than, I would say, cut stone, like in the Greek architecture. And then finally, the joint. So that's what we're going to look at today. And so it seemed the detailed joint was something of another time, of another age, where the architect could actually spend time and the client would have this kind of enlightened view of, wanting to be able to spend the amount of time and effort and money on joinery. And one of the kind of ideas of joinery and craftsmanship come to mind with this example of the Gamble House by these two brother architects, Green and Green, in California. Has anyone ever seen this house? It's really wonderful. If you're ever in LA, it's worth a trip, and they have tours there and everything of this house. And it was, commissioned by this wealthy family, and I guess you would say, I don't know if this is exactly mission style, but you walk in and it's covered, you feel the sense of warmth because it's covered in all type of different carpentry. And also the way that this carpentry is, put together, they're looking at Japanese influence, not only in the ornament and the detailing, but also in the joinery influences on it. You can even see like all the custom, everything is bespoke. The cabinetry, the stained glass windows, the Tiffany lighting with the stained glass up above, to the mantelpieces, and even you could see this custom type of molding. It was seen as the job of the architect to have this type of care and looking in designing all these aspects of the house. One of the highlights is this staircase that goes up right as this is the main entrance right here with the stained glass window. And so as you would walk in, you would see this and all the careful joinery and detail, not just made up of wood. I mean, this is not put together with any type of nails, but they have these type of metal clasps. I think these are made out of brass, also to connect these members together. And you can, I don't know if you can see here, but this is all wooden pegs connecting, the balustrade with the handrail there. This is, again, that main entrance. The outside, is interesting, but the real detailing occurs. This is a little seating area also built in. And so, and it seems like it's all of one. It's all made out of the same material. It's not something that's just stuck on. You have the wooden floor, into the wooden furniture, into the wooden paneling, and then up into the ceiling as well. All of these, handmade ceramic tiles for the fireplaces, wooden beams here. And here, just you can see the influence in this motif of this Japanese cherry blossom. This is, I think, a part of, I don't know if this is part of the fireplace mantelpiece. And here, this is not a carving, but then some type of textile that was woven of cherry blossoms, that these panels that are underlaid behind this wooden joinery here. It's such an exquisite building. And so I don't know if anyone here will ever have the chance. It seems like a lost moment that can never, because to build this type of building today, and to have, the kind of stars of aligning, to have a patron that could afford the type of work that would happen, plus being able, to find someone who could actually make this. It doesn't seem like it can happen anymore. But I think it's something, in my mind, when you see examples of architecture like this, what detail can do to define a building. It kind of gives me hope again. Another large inspiration, and one that is a kind of a touchstone when we go and talk about detail in architecture, is the work of Carlo Scarpa. I'm sorry, some of these are like partial titles, but the full attribution and dates and places are on your lecture notes, I believe. So this is the garden at the Cornini Stampaglia in Venice, this foundation. And you can see great care has been taken using stone plus concrete, using these, judgment. It's almost like, three-dimensional artistic sculptures or compositions. When to use reinforced concrete with kind of a brute formwork, showing the formwork, versus, when to use cut stone, where he has it here, that's inlaid to like yet another type of floor patterning. And then, having this, using this kind of as a means of sculpture, of having some of the water in this pond and to come down. And so it's this kind of motif, this flowing of water. So you don't really think of water as a building material, but that, that is what Scarpa is using here as well. And also we'll see in some other examples, light, using natural sunlight as a building material, as something that you also detail, we'll see, especially looking at Kahn and some other examples. One of the really interesting case studies, and it's not a project that you think comes around quite often, but it was for a tomb and sanctuary for this wealthy, I think they were Italian family called Brion in northern Italy. I'm not sure if they were northern Italian or Swiss, but this family was the owner of this electronics company. I don't know if any of you have seen, this type of electronics from the 60s. They're extremely stylish. Actually, this is a Brion Vega. That's the brand name. And so this is how, I guess, continuation of that family's wealth was selling these products. Actually, I've even seen these in some of the antique shops down on Smith Street in Collingwood. This is a Brion Vega, a stereo by the Castiglione brothers, in '65. So they were definitely a firm that was into, high-end design. And they would have Italy's top industrial designers designing their work. Here's this wonderful red, television, and here's another one that's just a perfect square black cube for early TV, 1969. So, design was a big, important for them. So they got one of Italy's most noted architects to design the family tomb and sanctuary. And here you can see how large this, I guess you could say, complex is, where there's a pavilion and garden and courtyard, chapel, and then there's the parents' chapel. Here's some images of that pond in which the garden, it's kind of this L-shaped building is surrounding this courtyard. Here's some images of the interior spaces. Now this is one of Scarpa's later works. We're going to go back in time and show you some of his earlier works. A lot of this is just reinforced concrete. And a lot of the interesting detailing, and this is a similarity, I guess you could say, that he shared with Auguste Perret that we saw with his columns of, working with the Hennebeek system of reinforced concrete. When you're dealing with concrete, we don't really talk about formwork, but, if you're imagining how to create detail, designing the formwork is equally as important to getting the result that you want. Auguste Perret was also interested, he didn't need for using a cut stone column, you would have these huge base at the bottom to support the load, and of course the entases going up with a capital. With reinforced concrete, you didn't need that. And so his columns went right up into, to connect to the beams with very little capital. And also, if he could make them, extremely tall without having to increase the diameter of the stone. So the kind of result of that, you would get these very high ceilings with, not taking up that much floor space. But anyway, we'll look at that again. But that's something that we don't really talk about, but a lot of this detail, this kind of stepping in motif that's throughout, this detail that's throughout the entire tomb and sanctuary is something that's designed in thinking about how this is going to be made, how the formwork is construction, and how the concrete will be poured. And Scarpa would do these amazing sketches. And, it's interesting, Diemer talks about who was the architect who she said would work on site in her, I can't remember who, Loos, yeah. And Scarpa would do the same thing, but he would have his drafting table on site, and he would, and you could see this wonderful sketch. You could see in plan, and there's parts that are colored, probably determining what material is what, and what's going to be meeting up next to something else. I mean, I find this so beautiful. And this is in plan, but then off to the side, you would see these other little sketches of, other detailing of how things will go together. And he would supposedly, have his drafting table on site, and the craftsman would come up to him and like, how do you want this done? And he would, it's, the architect's dream, right? Then doing that and handing it to the craftsman and doing it and, having this immediate feedback that rarely would happen, but maybe you never know. Here are just some of the actual, the tomb here. Also note the use of water. We're going to see that in a couple examples today, and how water can be used in terms of reflecting. Here's another interior of the tomb, the entrance. And also I love how this kind of untreated concrete, right? You just have this rough surface. So the way that he's using it as a means to communicate is through the shape, through the designing of the formwork, but then also allowing it, it's very poetic, like everyone, the cycle of life, death, decay, letting these kind of plants grow on top of it so that it seems like it's just as organic. It's almost like if it's just a stone that was there that was carved out rather than something that was built up. Here's another view. And he just doesn't have the wall here. The wall comes down and he cuts in a little bit, so then as you're walking, you can kind of begin that, view out into the courtyard, and the water slowly reveals itself. And then also, I'm sure at some point makes an interesting shadow on this wall here. I mean, look at the way the light also plays up above here on this kind of zigzag motif. Here, I don't know if you can see here, of course you see the lines of the formwork that over time age and they become more and more apparent, but then also embedded within that. And this takes planning, right? And it's not something that's slapped on. You would have had to design in a recess into, using the formwork, and then added, these are different types of tiles or stone tiles that are embedded into the concrete. Here again, the water that's going through the site. Here's another, it's quite elaborate. Different flooring, looks like a type of cobblestone that's, set in with poured concrete that then comes up to be a part of a, planter on one side and part half wall on this side, and then goes up. And then having that light come in and streaming against that wall, because he wants to show that texture, not only let light in. Look at that. That is quite beautiful, the way the light is kind of gradually coming in, hitting that surface, but it looks like it's graduated there. Here's another interesting detail. Right when you think the building should, and this is again thinking about earthwork, how does a building meet the ground? Chad Swartz talks about that with the Godsill building. How does your building meet the ground? And here, he has it floating on a pool of water, but then, kind of just when you think the base should be strong and thick and articulated, he does the opposite and cuts away from that, and which creates a bit of tension. But that's okay. It's not, it's an interesting one. And even these small little motifs that, again, planning into the formwork of having to kind of block this out. This is like making part of the wall as sculpture. So now that was one of his last projects. This is probably perhaps one of his first. This is an addition to a museum that's featuring the work of this artist Canova, well-known sculptor. And I think he was, I'm not sure when, maybe perhaps Baroque or neoclassical sculptor. And on the outside, it's a bit plain, not that exciting, except I find this window detail amazing, where you would normally just have this kind of rectangular box shape. But what does he do to kind of bring light? I'll show you the interior effect, to bring light into this museum. And we're going to look at a couple museum case studies. Lighting a museum is very tricky. Usually, you don't want a lot of direct light. Now, this is a museum of sculpture, so you do want light. But you also don't want people walking into just a cave, I have to say, like the NGV. I mean, you do want to have some natural light, just so you can have, even subconsciously, an understanding of the passage of time or some relationship to the outside. No one wants to walk around in this totally enclosed space. However, in a museum, right, there's functional needs. Direct light on painting, not only does it destroy the work, but it's difficult to see, so you want a diffused light. Does it always have to be natural? I mean, artificial? Not necessarily. But anyway, back to this case study. Instead of putting windows on the walls, which would, Scarpa makes these kind of windows out of the corners, but not just going out. They're inverted inside. So you have natural light coming into the space, not on one surface, but on 3 different surfaces, as you can see here, on this side here, and also below here. And this is what it's looking at. It looks like from the outside. And there's also, on this side as well. Here are just some other images of the space. This is not the whole entire museum, but that was just one really interesting detail. Another work by Scarpa, again in Venice, is the Olivetti showroom, which is off of St. Mark's Square. It still exists there, and you can see all of these case studies today, where you walk in and have this one type of surface, then you have mixed in with poured concrete, but also cut travertine stone, as well as wood. All of these, and metal. This kind of gathering of different images together, materials together, and looking at how they're put together. I mean, here these are, I think, polished stone, might be terrazzo, and all the steps are different lengths, but also at the same time, the way that they're constructed as if they're floating. They're not, you can see even here, they're not even touching the wall here. Over here, though, you can see the ceiling is made out of, I believe, either a wood paneling on top of concrete. So you can see this is kind of separated apart from the 2 sides as its own type of 3-dimensional compositional structure, right? You have this rail with a podium that the typewriter, which Olivetti, that is what they're selling. This is the commercial good here. I mean, it's like a showroom. But this part here looks like a 3-dimensional sculpture onto itself. Here's another part of it, detailing. This kind of, I believe this is part of a door, and the mechanism that allows it to move back and forth. So you have, how does this piece of metal connect to this, stone, which part of it looks like a bit pummeled, where this is smooth here, and then this is concrete. So we're looking at so many different materials here, and it's really an aesthetic sensitivity to understand how these come together. I mean, here you have, the same stone, but one's cut, they're cut into 2 different pieces, the square, one polished, and from a different, probably colored stone, but of the same stone, and the other one is not a honed finish, but giving it this actual texture. Again, how do these materials meet? You have a piece of, very thick wood bound together with a piece of metal, but it's not just laid upon this cut, looks like travertine stone, but he designs another metal piece, a type of bracket, so that it sits on top of that. Dark, but also leaving the space, so also giving this light of airiness and floating. And this is another picture image going back to the Fondazione Querini Stampaglia, the fountain feature here, where you have kind of a metal spout. This is a type of aggregate cement, but trimmed using cut stone. And then, having these kinds of concentric circles going in, knowing that through time, and age and sediment and algae and this kind of, mold or something's going to grow on it and start to patina it, but that's okay. You can kind of see the same thing here with this raw concrete, where this ambiguity between it being this natural stone element or something that's actually construction is allowed to happen in the building. This is just a detail of a handle. And again, this is not just concrete stone, using brass trim on the outside. So it's not just has this, keeping it kind of contained and design. And then this is my last example of scarpa, but perhaps one of my favorite. And it's of an existing building, this Castle Vecchio, which means old castle. But it was an old castle in Verona that was turned into a museum. And Scarpa was charged with renovating it in perhaps one of his longest works. It took, from 1959 to 1973. And so if you ever are around Verona, or even if you're going from like Milan to Venice, stop in Verona, because also there's a great little small stadium there, ancient stadium, that is also wonderful. And so it's along the river here. This is the complex here, the castle. This is a plan, and I have a book on it. It just shows you all the different stages of construction that happened. But this is like the majority of his interventions here. This is what it looks like as you enter this large courtyard. This is the area here. How many of you have seen this building before? Raise it. Not tutors. Any students? Okay. Because, it's really an amazing building. And especially adaptive reuse. So you enter the main courtyard here. And he has, again, designs the garden and some fountains, the motif of water, and a lot of even the designs how a lot of these archaeological pieces are going to be displayed. But what we're going to really look at here is this connection right here. This is happens where the larger court is connecting to a building that creates then the King's Court or the Queen's Court, this part here. And so you can see it's something that either there wasn't a strong connection or probably throughout time this connection just kind of fell apart. But as part of the museum, Scarpa uses what is actually a negative space in this overall kind of rectangular shaped courtyard, and then says, I'm going to really, I can't do everything in the museum, but this part, this negative space, this in-between space, I'm going to really concentrate on that and make it really this kind of connecting piece between these two spaces. But first, here is the exhibition spaces that were in that long part of the building that you saw when we walked in. And he's designing everything from how all these sculptures, the podiums and the exhibition displays. But here is that interior into this connection part, that I'm talking about here. This is a closer up. And already you can begin to see all the different, here is part of one of the pieces of the museum, but you can begin to see all the different types of materials that he's thinking that have to have this kind of historic feel. You don't want it to stick out too much like, oh, this is the old part or that's the new part. He wants to kind of say, oh, is there kind of ambiguity? Was this existing or could it easily fit in? And I think his selection and combination of materials, that's, what makes his work brilliant. And so you have this, here you can see this old medieval wall, but he adds in this metal staircase that's just metal, that's bent, and this is one entire piece. I guess you could say step. There's no treads there. It's just a space. And so kind of just minimally touching the existing historic building. And then enhancing what is existing there, these timbers there. Either he's adding to that, imagining what it looked like, or just letting them be. And here, instead of just kind of slapping on one floor on top of the other, he cuts away here and letting you kind of preview the space that's going down. And with the same metal that he's using for this kind of bent metal for the steps of the stair, using it for the handrail. But he wants you to see through, so these are just small, thin wires for the balustrade, and then cut pieces of large, seem like travertine tiles that seem somewhat similar to this sculpture. This is a view looking down on that same space here. And look at all these different layers and levels of the stair. With the stair are stone, as you can kind of see going around. But then this pedestal where the statue is, reinforced concrete with highly articulated the formwork in that. And then you have the stone structure. But there you have the stair going up. Even there, these seem to be poured concrete, but the tips of the steps are lined in the same metal that's used on the handrails. And then this bridge, which on the first floor is connecting those two different courtyards over that negative space, void, he uses a different type of a balustrade made out of wooden panels that also reflect these panels that I'll show you up that are lining this kind of, the edge of the existing building, and you can see up above. I have another image to show you that. But here's just some sketches on trace. You can see this is just like a handrail detail, and how he wants to section off the visitors from the artwork and detailing how that connection is put together. And so here we were looking up at that connecting space. Here we're on the ground level and looking at all the different levels and different materials coming together. I mean, he really sees the space as a three-dimensional composition of materials and shapes. I mean, that's the only way I can kind of describe it. And here's the wood paneling I was talking about here and up above here. And these are materials that are, were around. They could have been used during medieval times, but he's just reconfiguring them in a modern way. And that's how, through this materiality, he's connecting this historic building, the old with the new. Not through the shapes, not just kind of in an artificial way recreating a medieval design, but he's able to connect with the past using medieval materials. And this is just a drawing of that space, and then his kind of sketch, also kind of figuring out, the bridge here, what's that shadow, and figuring out the materials and the stair. And so also, this very important sculpture, the stair is winding around it. Not only is the stair helping you get to another floor, but you're also getting to observe this sculpture in the round, walking around it, seeing it from different angles. Okay, so now we go to another architect. You can see he's one of the, especially for the 20th century, the father of tectonics, and that's Lou Kahn. And I like this case of the Esherick House because it shows what I was talking about, and what Frescari was talking about, this mimeticism in detailing, where if you have a small detail and how that can reverberate throughout the entire design of the house. And so this is a perfect example. It's a small house, not very large. Here's the floor plan. But he chooses this motif. This is just a first and second floor. Very simple. And it's a house in Philadelphia where his practice was. And he taught a bit, I think, at Penn, University of Penn. But if you see this here, The house is made out of both, I'll go back to this plan, but as you can see here, it's made out of two materials, concrete or some type of stone, masonry, and it's kind of infilled. And you can see, like, now we're going to begin to see, like, what are some tricks of these architects to show off detail. And for Kahn, a lot of time, it's using stone or masonry, some type of masonry or brick, and then knowing when you want to have some type of, I guess, not only a contrasting of materials, but know the kind of appropriateness of when to use what materials where. And for him, a lot of that time is using some kind of shell, masonry or concrete or brick shell, but then when you're getting down to like another part, using wooden panels, usually containing windows, which can be custom made, and then kind of using that as infill to the larger concrete or masonry shell. And you can see that here, where I'm going to go back to the plan. You can see with the darker outlines are masonry, but where he's going to have these windows are surrounded in these ornate wood type paneling. Also notice here the shape of this building where it kind of juts in. It's a rectangle, but then at 2 points opposite in a symmetrical way, it juts out. This is a fireplace here. This, I think, is a window. And here there's a function of the kind of foyer type of space, the entrance to the house. And this is both on the first and ground floor. Sorry. This is that in the back where he has a balcony space, but it kind of juts in and juts out. This is just another view of that. And then in the interior space, so this is a domestic space, and so instead of having a lot of cold, hard concrete, it's almost as if he lines that interior with a lot of woodwork, the floors, the windows, and then even, this is a separate photo here, but even, which I'm not really sure about, but even around, say, the bathtub. And then insets here, like a little shelves. But when I'm talking about the detail here, is this is also how a lot of this woodwork is joined together. And so I don't know if you can recognize in this one joint of the carpentry here, this is the same motif that you can see in the plan as well. So something very simple. This is probably not a large commission for him, but it was an opportunity for him to use something, the way the wood interior joinery, the kind of diagram of that joint was used as a diagram for the planning of the space of that house. Very simple, but interesting, so when you're seeing this around your house, something that, the everydayness, and going to see quite up close, not in passing, and being able to contemplate, that's where, he puts the, packs a punch for these kind of things that people are everyday things that you're going to see every day, you're going to touch every day. And so that's where the detailing is going to go. He's not going to put it necessarily on the outside, around the house that you're not going to see or pass by or so on and so forth. And you're not going to have this level of detailing if you're doing, say, an airport or, where you're coming and going. It's not really where you're going to stop and contemplate and think about things. Here's another, and this is a trick, for detailing. Right where the places where you think tectonically or structurally you would have a lot of things built up in terms of massing of the structure, he takes away and usually will have some type of lighting or window. Just we were talking about the Pantheon the other day, right at the top where you would think you would need the most structure. What do the Romans do? They take away and have that negative skylight. My mind is blanking what it's called. Oculus. Kahn is doing that same thing. Thank you. Kahn is doing that same thing, but in many different iterations. Here, this is a view of the outside of the house. You can see here. And where the, instead of having the hearth or the fireplace up against and reinforcing that, he steps it away from the house and then uses that connection using glass. So during the day, light is coming in there and using that as a window. So where else does he do that? He does it here at the Salk Institute. I'm sure you're all familiar with this building. But again, that technique of using, this heavy stereotomic massing of cast concrete as a type of shell. And then when you're getting down into smaller scale, these are individual offices of the scientists in there. And also you can see they're all different sizes. So it's a lot easier to customize a wooden panel containing, different size windows, having that done through, using wood and a carpenter, whereas you can't really do that quite easily. So the kind of generic spaces, generic forms, this massing, concrete, smaller, more bespoke panels to give smaller, relating to the smaller scale. But so how does he connect these two seemingly disparate materials of wood and precast concrete? And again, using the water. Here, this is the interior of one of those science offices. And so what does he do? He uses glass to kind of illuminate that what would be a tricky connection between, this wooden, I guess you could say panel holding the fenestration, the wood and bookcases and so forth, but he has a piece of glass here joining the concrete and the wood, and also here. And so what does that do? It allows, he's kind of, pointing out, showing, having light, natural light at these spaces so that you can see and highlighting these two different materialities, but also you can see the effect that's happening here. You have that beautiful natural light cascading across that kind of brute precast concrete wall there. Here's just a view of it from the outside. And this is here another view of that from the outside there. And here I do have a detail. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on this projection. And here you have the wall coming in at an angle. So how does he rectify that? It's really just a piece of glass with some caulking there. It's not that highly detailed, that in and of itself. Actually, I don't really. This is actually, I think, trying to figure out where's the glass. I guess that's it right there. Oh, here's another one. Yeah. Here's the frame, the wooden frame, and with the window. And then it's just a mere piece of glass. You can see here, and there's just a little channel, either cut or, cut into the concrete where that piece of glass is kind of, probably with some type of gasket or something like that, is set into, joining the wooden frame, and then here you can see the concrete. Very, very simple. Oh no. All right, I just have some leftover images of Castelvecchio. I'm going to go forward with that. Let's look at a more local example. And actually, this is a great place even to go in the cold days of Melbourne winter. It's about an hour and a half from here in Hepburn Springs. This is a bathhouse, Hepburn Springs Bathhouse in Victoria, by Cox Architect. Has anyone here been there? Any students? Oh, you have to go. It's a wonderful space. I mean, it's a wonderful place to go. but it's also architecturally a wonderful space. This Hepburn Springs has always been a center historically in Victoria as a bathhouse there. People living in Melbourne, when they needed firewood, they would travel out of the city to this area to cut down their wood. But before coming home, the men would want to take a bath, and they would have this bathhouse here in Hepburn Springs. And in 2009, Cox Architect did a renovation, did a building in this space, which I think is wonderful, a wonderful example of use of different materials joining together, and really also using materials and their sensuality, their kind of to actually, speak to people, and because you're very vulnerable in the bathhouse, right? You're in a robe, you're in a bathing suit, getting changed, but also appealing to your senses. And so this is actually, I'm trying to think what part of this is. Part of it. So this is, say, the pool, the bathhouse, and then there is this large structure on top. Let me just... This is what it looks like from the outside. And when you enter this space, there's kind of like a mezzanine level, and then you go down below where there's all the pools and the springs. Here's another image of what it looks from the outside, and you see here they have the remaining like smokestack for when they used to use when, in the olden days, I guess you could say, when they would use this as original bathhouse, and they kept this here. But this is the general bathhouse and changing rooms. When you would enter onto that bridge from back behind here, there's like the lobby, and then you go downstairs to the changing room, and then here are all the pools. And then you're looking out over here into some woods and a little creek. This is what this space looks like from when you're entering from the space. And there's even a skylight here that's looking down onto one of the other pools. And so if you're just looking at this one image, there's so many different materials that they're playing with. Again, they have the poured concrete with very evident formwork. This kind of brick in the back that's also then capped with a type of concrete. These wonderful columns with these articulated joints of how, they're wood, but then the joint is actually made out of steel and bolted into the wood here, and then steel members here, another type of wood paneling for, I'm sure, the acoustics up above, and then wood over here and another type of tile all throughout. Here's just coming, these are this is up here where you would enter, so it's somewhat of a mezzanine level, but when you go into the baths, it's very open space. And look at that, even the formwork here, you can see that's just dividing. This is kind of, one space was more like a general admission, and then if you want to pay more money, you can go into the more separate different baths and saunas and the plunge pools and stuff like that. But even look at this wall where you can see the wood of the formwork, but then there's another, kind of indentation and another texture just within that wall. Here's just another view of that. And here, even at the pool's edge, or the spring's edge, are these. It's a different type of aggregate. It's not concrete, but it's made out of all these different types of smooth stones. So your body's feeling the water, the steam. Your feet have the texture of these stones on them. This is just the stairwell leading from the reception down to the change rooms. And here was that a type of oculus. This is the magnesium bath that has different types of minerals in it. And then even off to this, there's different showers you can take. And look at the lighting here. you have natural light, but then you have this artificial light coming, highlighting these walls. And this is the main, I was saying that main bath area where you're looking out into the forest. And then look at these columns here that are all throughout, and how this joint is coming together here using metal and wood. Beautifully designed. Let's see if I have time for one more case study. This is by Wang Shu, who you read a couple weeks ago, about his approach. Today, this is just a small building that he designed. It was a cafe within this larger architecture park that was curated by Ai Weiwei in 2006. And I didn't really notice almost all these case studies have the use of water here. But what Wang Shu was using as this means of inspiration was this ceramic inkwell. And he liked how it was all made out of one material, but that also the surface kind of went and sloped down. And he kind of used that as a model for how he was going to create the form of this cafe. And so also this idea of ceramics is a motif. So instead of having an actual designed detail, it's the material as a detail that is kind of a motif throughout this. And so he likes these ceramic inkwells. This is the one that he actually, I think, is closest to what he uses, because in this area, he says it rains a lot. So also he wanted the building to kind of form water. And so where this picture is taken is inside the cafe, but you would have the kind of rain come down and then trickle down the surface, and then to make part of that pool in which you saw at the front of the cafe. But also what is beautiful about this building is the surface of the building. Here, his friend, who was also into earthenware, made all of these different samples of porcelain using all these different types of dyes. And so he asked them, since it's also based on this idea of a ceramic inkwell, he also asked them if he could use these pieces of porcelain on the exterior, making not only a texture, but a certain type of color of all these natural earth tones in it. And that's what you can kind of see here. This is the plan of that building. Here is the reflecting pool. And here was that space where the rain would come down and goes basically underneath the building and fuels this pool. And this is the actual cafe here. This is what it looks like in section. And you can see it's almost, how that inkwell and that sloping surface created that type of space. Here is the reflecting pool empty. There's no water in it. Here's the actual cafe here. And here it is from above, and just another detail of the porcelain tiles that are used for that. All right, I'm going to end my lecture here. We'll start up talking next week about one of my new discovered buildings, the Barnes Foundation by Billy Chen and Todd Williams. Thanks. I just need to log off. I know I'm done.
Take it.
Friday.
It is, right? Yeah, for some reason I still did not realize that.
Yeah, it's like week 5 next week. Can you believe it?
God.
It's not so bad once you get through those first couple of weeks. Tell you
I
the truth.
know, I know. I'm teaching this course for the first time, and it's a lot to take in. But now I'm getting finally settled into some sort of a rhythm.
Yeah, now it's really, and then before you know it, we're